Before we begin, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any stories like this. Dark tales, forgotten mysteries, and places where silence hides more than it seems. Turn on notifications to follow each new episode. And now, tell me in the comments, where are you watching this story from? It could be your city, your state, or your country. The mansion stood atop the hill like a presence that didn't need to assert itself. It simply stood there, motionless, observing. Its high, light-colored stone walls surrounded the property almost aggressively, not as protection, but as a silent warning. Those passing by on the narrow road felt the strange need to slow down, even without understanding why. There were no signs, no chains, no guards, yet something made it clear that this place did not expect visitors. Ethan Caldwell arrived on a cloudy October afternoon, the sky too heavy for that time of year. An investigative journalist, known for exposing forgotten stories and abandoned cases, he didn't believe in coincidences. When he received a letter with no return address mentioning the Blackwood Hill mansion, an old building, officially abandoned for decades, he knew it wasn't just another vague complaint. The letter didn't ask for help. It didn't make threats. It only had one sentence written by hand in irregular handwriting. The silence in this house is not emptiness, it is restraint. Ethan was not an impressionable man. He had already spent nights in abandoned hospitals, deactivated prisons, and ghost towns. Still, as he crossed the rusty gate of the mansion, he felt something different. The air seemed denser, as if each breath required effort. The wind blew weakly, but made no sound as it touched the dry trees in the garden. Not a leaf stirred. The house was enormous, built at the end of the 19th century, with tall, narrow windows that resembled watchful eyes. Many were broken, others completely surrounded by old boards. The silence there was unnatural. There were no birds, insects, or any sign of life around. Not even the typical creaking of an old structure could be heard. It was as if the mansion were trapping the sound inside itself. The antagonist in that story had no face, name, or clear form. It wasn't a person waiting in the shadows, nor a creature watching from the windows. It was the house itself. Or more precisely, what remained hidden inside it. Ethan quickly realized that this place hadn't just been abandoned. It had been left behind abruptly, as if everyone had left at the same time. A rusty wheelbarrow still lay near the side entrance. Empty bottles were scattered around the garden, as if someone had tried to forget something there. The exterior walls bore dark marks that time hadn't been able to completely erase. As he pushed the front door, he encountered resistance. Not from locks, but as if something on the other side was holding it open. When the door finally gave way, the sound of the impact echoed briefly and was swallowed up. The echo died too quickly. Inside the house, the silence was even more oppressive. The entrance hall was spacious, with a central staircase that split into 2 flights. The once elegant carpet was torn and stained. Pictures hung crookedly on the walls, many with their canvases ripped from the inside out. There were no clear signs of common vandalism. It looked more like a desperate attack than a robbery. Ethan walked slowly, noting every detail. His steps made no sound. Not even the old wooden floor reacted to the weight of his body. He tried to speak aloud, just to test it. His own voice sounded strange, muffled, as if it were being absorbed by the walls. It was then that he noticed something that wasn't in any official record. A second door at the back of the hall, almost imperceptible, camouflaged in the wall. It didn't appear in old blueprints of the mansion. There was no visible doorknob, only deep marks in the wood, like scratches made by human fingernails. The conflict was brewing there, silent and invisible. Ethan wasn't just investigating an abandoned place. He was challenging something that had remained hidden for decades, something that seemed unwilling to be found, but also wouldn't allow itself to be forgotten. When a slight vibration ran through the floor beneath his feet, he understood that this mansion was not merely a backdrop. It was an active participant in everything that was about to happen, and the silence, once absolute, began to seem like a threat. Ethan spent the first few minutes exploring the ground floor, attentive to any changes in the environment. The mansion seemed to react to his presence in subtle, almost imperceptible ways. The shadows stretched longer than they should, even without a clear light source. The air, previously only heavy, now carried an ancient odor, a mixture of damp wood, rust, and something more difficult to identify, like fabric burned long ago. The scene began to reveal fragments of an interrupted history. The living room still had furniture arranged in an organized manner, as if the former residents expected to return at any moment. A stopped wall clock showed 2:17 a.m. There wasn't enough dust to justify decades of complete neglect. It indicated occasional visits, or something that had remained there all along. On the fireplace, Ethan found old photos scattered on the floor. They depicted the Blackwood family, the former owners of the mansion. The patriarch, Henry Blackwood, always appeared serious, with a hard look and rigid posture. His wife, Margaret, appeared in few images and almost always on the sidelines, as if she were being erased from the family's own memory. There were also 3 children. None of the photos were dated later than 1963. Public records stated that the family had left town after a domestic tragedy. No body was found, no thorough investigation. The case was closed quickly, something unusual even by old standards. Ethan now understood why that story had never been properly clarified. Someone wanted it forgotten. As he made his way into the dining room, the journalist noticed marks on the floor, deep lines running from one corner of the room to the other, as if heavy furniture had been repeatedly dragged. The ceiling had irregular cracks, always concentrated in the center of the house, as if something had pressed against the structure from the inside out. Secondary characters began to take shape in Ethan's mind. The former caretaker of the property, mentioned in a local newspaper he had read before the trip, had disappeared months after the mansion was abandoned. A pastor from the region had been called at the time, but never spoke publicly about what had happened again. There were also vague accounts from neighbors who mentioned muffled sounds coming from the hill during the early morning hours, for years on end, even after the house was considered empty. Every detail of the environment directly influenced his decisions. Ethan felt that staying in a single room for too long was a mistake. The silence wasn't passive, it was pressing. The longer he stood still, the more he felt he was being watched, not from a fixed point, but from every angle at once. As he climbed the main staircase, he noticed that the handrails were worn only in certain sections, as if hands had passed over them repeatedly, always at the same rhythm. On the second floor, closed doors lined a narrow corridor. Some were locked, others merely ajar. None creaked when touched. Inside one of the rooms, possibly belonging to one of the children, Ethan found drawings made directly on the wall. They weren't childish. They depicted faceless human figures, surrounded by high walls, with thick lines crossing their mouths. In all the drawings, the house appeared larger than the people. The antagonism of that place was beginning to become clearer. It wasn't just a vague supernatural force. It was something constructed, fueled by human decisions, by secrets, kept by force. The mansion hadn't been cursed by chance. It had been transformed into a receptacle. Ethan began to understand that the horror lay not only in what had happened there, but in the silent pact made by the surrounding community. The town had grown pretending that Hill didn't exist. Roads were diverted, maps were altered, records disappeared. The mansion's isolation wasn't geographical, it was deliberate. When he returned to the hallway, he noticed something new, a door at the end that hadn't been there before. Dark, without any details, it clashed with the rest of the architecture. It seemed to absorb the little light that was there. The world of that story closed in around him, revealing that each absent character, each collective silence, had contributed to keeping something contained behind those walls. And now Ethan was inside. The presence of the new door at the end of the corridor didn't seem like a forgotten architectural detail. It imposed itself like an unwanted, silent yet insistent invitation. Ethan remained motionless for a few seconds, trying to discern if anything else had changed around him. The corridor seemed slightly narrower, as if the walls had moved imperceptibly as he explored the rooms. He decided not to go straight to the door. Experience had taught him that places like that punished impulsive decisions. Instead, he opened another room to the left. The room was almost untouched. The bed was made, a bedside table with a closed book, an open suitcase in the corner, with clothes hastily folded. This wasn't planned abandonment, it was escape. As Ethan approached the suitcase, the floor gave way slightly beneath his feet. It didn't break, but the dry sound, one of the few that managed to manifest itself in that place, reverberated abnormally. The silence responded as a warning. Soon after, he noticed something new, a continuous vibration, almost like a slow breathing running through the walls. The conflict ceased to be merely investigative. It became physical, sensory. The mansion reacted when he got too close to certain truths. Ethan left the room and walked down the hallway, now determined to face the dark door. With each step, he felt a growing pressure in his ears, as if he were rapidly descending to a great depth. Upon touching the wood of the door, his hand was overcome by an intense cold, completely incompatible with the ambient temperature. The door opened by itself. On the other side, there wasn't an ordinary room, but a narrow spiral staircase descending. The walls were of rough stone. Unlike the rest of the house, that structure wasn't mentioned in any historical record. It was older than the mansion itself. The air down there was suffocating, heavy with dampness and something metallic. As he descended, Ethan began to hear sounds, not exactly voices, but muffled vibrations, as if someone were trying to shout with their mouth covered. The conflict gained new layers. It wasn't just about the Blackwood family's past, but something that had been kept there for generations. At the bottom of the stairs, he found a circular room. The floor was marked with symbols forcibly scratched in, some overlapping, as if different people had tried to erase or reinforce the drawings over time. In the center of the room, there was a rusty iron structure resembling an open cage, deformed from the inside. Ethan quickly realized that the room wasn't meant to hold bodies. It was meant to contain something that needed to remain silent. As he approached the structure, the environment reacted violently. The walls began to vibrate more intensely, and the symbols on the floor seemed to deepen, as if they were being redrawn on their own. The journalist instinctively recoiled, but tripped and fell, hitting his shoulder hard on the stone floor. At that moment, the conflict intensified with the arrival of new elements. Ethan heard footsteps upstairs. They weren't echoes of the past. They were present. Someone else was in the mansion. The unexpected presence forced an immediate change in their decisions. Staying down there meant being trapped. Going up, however, meant crossing paths with whoever was walking around the house. Someone who, most likely, knew exactly what that place hid. As he hurried up the stairs, Ethan noticed that the symbols on the walls seemed to follow him, reappearing ahead, as if the path were being rewritten. When he finally emerged into the second-floor hallway, the door behind him slammed shut, producing a sound far too loud for that place. The silence then changed its nature. Now he seemed attentive. The footsteps ceased. Instead, a slow, rustling sound came from the ground floor, like furniture being moved again. The mansion was rearranging itself. Doors that had been open were now closed. The path back to the main entrance had disappeared, replaced by a corridor he didn't recognize. Secondary characters began to manifest themselves, even without appearing directly. Someone was keeping that place under surveillance. Someone continued to feed what was trapped down there. The main conflict was solidifying. Ethan not only needed to reveal what happened to the Blackwood family, but he also needed to survive long enough to leave the mansion with the truth. And for the first time since he entered, he understood that perhaps the house didn't want to kill him. Perhaps she wanted to be heard. The hallway Ethan was in wasn't part of the mansion's original floor plan. He walked in a straight line for far too long, for a space that, from the outside, didn't exist. The walls, covered in old, stained wallpaper, looked newer than the rest of the house, as if that section had been added later, not by builders but out of necessity. The first subplot was revealed when he found a half-open door in the middle of the hallway. Inside, there was a small makeshift office, a simple desk, a hard chair, and a shelf crammed with notebooks. They weren't old. Some were recently dated from the last 5 years. Someone had been keeping constant records about the mansion. Ethan flipped through the notebooks quickly. The entries were short, almost obsessive. Notes on schedules, sounds, structural changes, variations in silence. There were names crossed out repeatedly, always erased forcefully, until the paper tore. Among them, one appeared more frequently: Caleb. This discovery added a new layer to the conflict. The mansion wasn't just abandoned, it was being monitored, cared for, controlled. The second subplot emerged when Ethan found photographs hidden inside a false drawer. The images showed the interior of the underground circular room, taken at different times. In some, the iron cage was intact. In others, it was visibly deformed. In all of them, something stood out, human marks on the floor, as if people had remained kneeling there for long periods. These photos indicated an ongoing ritual, not an isolated event from the past. The Blackwood family had only been part of something larger. Time pressure began to manifest itself when Ethan realized that the mansion reacted differently to the passage of time. The further he advanced, the faster the changes occurred. Walls closed in, doors appeared and disappeared. Remaining still meant allowing the space to reorganize itself around him, reducing his options for escape. As he left the office, he heard a new sound, a rhythmic, metallic ringing coming from somewhere below. It wasn't random. It was intentional. Someone was activating something. Another subplot developed from within the local community. Fragments of conversations recorded on an old tape recorder, found inside a box, revealed different voices discussing maintenance, balance, and symbolic sacrifice. They weren't fanatical cultists. They were ordinary residents, speaking with unsettling nonchalance about keeping something contained for the good of the town. The mansion then ceased to be merely an isolated place. It became the epicenter of a silent agreement between generations. A pact sustained by omission, fear, and convenience. The complexity increased as Ethan connected the subplots. The man named Caleb was likely the one currently responsible for ensuring the silence was never broken. Recent records indicated that something was spiraling out of control. The structural changes to the house were intensifying. The contents of the underground cage no longer tolerated passive containment. The stopped clock Ethan had seen on the ground floor now made sense. It wasn't marking a random time. It represented the exact moment something had been sealed. And now, decades later, the seal was weakening. When the metallic sound abruptly ceased, silence returned aggressively, almost hostilely. Ethan felt a sharp pain in his head, as if thoughts that weren't his were trying to impose themselves. Quick images appeared, people being pushed into the underground room, mouths covered, walls being erected. He realized that he faced not just one threat, but several conflicting forces. The contained entity, those responsible for keeping it imprisoned, and himself, an external element not part of the agreement. The pressure of time became critical when a deep vibration coursed through the mansion like a final warning. Something was about to happen, with or without his interference. The subplots converged on the same point. The silence was about to be broken, and when that happened, no one inside the mansion would escape unscathed. The first crack echoed from within the walls, deep and dry, as if something massive had shifted beneath the mansion's structure. Ethan instinctively leaned against the wall, feeling the vibration course through his body. It wasn't a random tremor. It was a reaction. Something had been triggered. The hallway door, the one that hadn't been there before, reappeared behind him, now ajar. A sliver of yellowish light escaped through the crack, pulsing in the same rhythm as the vibrations. Ethan understood that the house was no longer merely rearranging itself. It was conducting itself. Upon crossing the threshold, he encountered a staircase unlike the previous one. It wasn't the old stone passage. This one seemed more recent, hastily constructed, with rough wooden steps reinforced by iron bars. Handprints were imprinted on the walls, some overlapping, as if several people had been forced to descend there over time. At the bottom of the stairs, the revelation awaited. The underground room was not empty. The iron cage remained in the center, but now it was closed. Inside, there was no defined creature, no body. There was something that manifested as absence, a distortion in the air, a space where the gaze could not fix. The silence there was not merely a lack of sound. It was an active force, pressing down on everything around it. And standing in front of the cage, with his back to Ethan, was a man, Caleb. He looked exhausted, older than the photos suggested. His hands trembled as he held an old key, attached to a thick cord. The metallic sound Ethan had heard earlier came from there. Caleb was trying to reinforce something that no longer obeyed him. "You shouldn't be here," he said without turning around. The voice did not echo. It was swallowed up immediately. The turning point solidified when Caleb revealed the truth that rewrote everything Ethan believed he was investigating. The Blackwood family hadn't been victims of the house. They had been volunteers. They had been the first to agree to keep what was there contained, believing that silence would protect the town from something far worse. But the agreement required continuity. When one generation weakened, another needed to take over. Caleb's role was not that of an ordinary jailer. He was the last link in a silent succession responsible for maintaining containment, not with blood, as Ethan had hoped, but with presence. Someone needed to remain there, to hear what could not be heard, to feel the weight of the silence so that it would not expand beyond those walls. The fatal mistake had occurred when Caleb tried to simplify the ritual, to shorten the time, to make the task less arduous. The silence would not accept it. As he spoke, the distortion within the cage began to expand slowly. Like an inverted shadow, the iron bars creaked, bending inward as if being sucked in. The entire mansion responded. Doors slammed shut above them in succession. The stopped clock on the ground floor fell from the wall, marking 2:17 again before shattering. The walls began to emit a low sound, similar to a muffled chorus, and then came the final revelation. Caleb wasn't trying to keep quiet. I was trying to transfer it. He turned slowly to Ethan, his eyes marked by something that wasn't just fear. It was relief. The journalist understood in that instant. The house hadn't led him there by chance. He had been chosen. The silence needed someone new to sustain it, someone from outside the original pact, someone whose absence wouldn't be immediately felt by the community. The turning point wasn't just narrative, it was existential. Ethan stepped back, but the ground beneath his feet closed in, forming a circle of symbols he recognized from the children's drawings on the walls. The house was ready. It always had been. The emotional transformation occurred without long monologues or heroic decisions, just raw understanding. Ethan realized he wasn't there to reveal the truth to the world. He was there to become a part of it. When the cage began to open on its own, the silence ceased to be oppressive and became inviting. For the first time since entering the mansion, Ethan felt no fear. He felt a sense of purpose. Silence settled in the air like a satisfied entity. There was no explosion, no screams, no immediate collapse of the structure. The mansion's reaction was more subtle and therefore more unsettling. The vibrations ceased. The walls stopped moving. The constant pressure in Ethan's ears gradually lessened, as if something had stabilized. Caleb dropped the key on the stone floor. The metallic sound, once so distinctive, now sounded out of place, almost forbidden. He breathed heavily, leaning against the warped cage, but the relief on his face was undeniable. The distortion inside the structure lessened, slowly receding, as if being absorbed by something else. By Ethan. He felt the impact of the change first in his body. A weight settled in his chest, deep and constant, as if he were supporting something invisible. It wasn't pain, it was responsibility. His senses adjusted to the new condition even before his mind could formulate clear thoughts. Emotional reactions manifested themselves through actions. Ethan tried to speak, but no words came out. Not because he was prevented, but because there was no need. Silence was no longer an obstacle. It was a language. Caleb, now free from the role that had consumed him for decades, seemed to shrink. His posture, once rigid, became fragile. He did not celebrate. He simply walked away slowly, like someone leaving an altar after a long vigil. His departure was not impeded by the house. On the contrary, the corridors opened for him in an almost respectful manner. The clearest immediate consequence was the reorganization of the mansion. Doors reappeared in coherent places. Stairs once again connected floors in a logical way. The space ceased to be hostile because it no longer needed to test its limits. The foreign element had found a new anchor point. Ethan went upstairs without resistance. Each step reinforced the change. He no longer needed to orient himself visually. He knew where each hallway ended. He knew which doors led nowhere and which had a real function. The house now responded to him, but this connection came at a clear emotional cost. Images that weren't his own began to emerge. The Blackwood family accepting the pact, children drawing the silence without understanding, generations of residents arguing about who would take over when the time came. Ethan not only knew, he remembered. The psychological reaction wasn't despair, but isolation. He understood that this truth couldn't be shared, not because of external threats, but because of incompatibility. The outside world wouldn't have the capacity to understand what it meant to maintain silence. Outside the mansion, the consequences also began to manifest. The town below the hill would experience peaceful nights again. Reports of unexplained noises would cease. Detours on the roads would no longer seem necessary. Nothing would be officially explained. And that was part of the balance. Ethan walked to the front door. The late afternoon light streamed through the windows, something that hadn't happened before. The silence hadn't disappeared, but now it flowed in a controlled, focused way. He opened the door and took a step outside. The house didn't stop him, but something inside him remained. The final reaction was silent, yet definitive. Ethan understood that he could still leave, but he could never truly go away. The real consequence of the tipping point wasn't prison, it was a sense of belonging. Night fell slowly over the hill, and for the first time, the mansion didn't seem menacing in the darkness. Ethan stood outside for a few minutes, watching the unevenly lit windows, as if the house were relearning how to breathe. He could have left right then. The road was clear, the car was still waiting for him. Nothing physically prevented him from leaving that place. Still, he didn't move. Growth didn't come as a grand decision or a moment of explicit courage. It came in the form of practical acceptance. Ethan realized he didn't need to run because the fear had shifted. It was no longer in front of him, but integrated into his perception. He now understood what he had previously only investigated. The first challenge arose when silence began to expand within him in a disordered way. It wasn't aggressive, but unstable. Fragments of old memories emerged without warning. Voices whispered behind walls, hands tapping on solid wood. Pleas cut short before becoming sound. Ethan needed to learn to filter, not block, direct. He returned to the mansion of his own accord. Each step inside the house demanded a new posture. Before he reacted, now he needed to act with intention. As he crossed the main hall, he felt the structure respond differently. No longer as a test, but as a silent question. How long can you sustain this? The growth was gradual and visible in simple actions. Ethan began to reorganize spaces that had previously seemed chaotic, not physically, but functionally. He closed doors that led to unnecessary echo cycles. He reopened passageways that allowed silence to flow without concentrating too much on a single point. The mansion was no longer a labyrinth. It had become a system. The next challenge came with the temptation to repeat past mistakes. He found records from previous generations, attempts to control too much, to mold silence according to personal or collective interests. Each of these attempts had weakened the balance. Ethan understood that his role was not to dominate, but to maintain. This understanding marked his definitive transformation. The journalist who sought to reveal external truths gave way to someone who upheld an internal, invisible, and necessary truth. There was no longer any urgency to document, photograph, or denounce. The world didn't need that information. It only needed the result. As the hours passed, the silence settled. The constant pressure lessened, until it became an almost imperceptible background noise. Ethan could think clearly, move effortlessly, rest without intrusive images. Growth didn't mean weightlessness, but rather adaptation to it. In a symbolic moment, he went up to the children's room, where he had found the drawings on the wall. The faceless human figures remained there, but something had changed. The lines crossing the mouths no longer seemed aggressive. They were boundaries, choices. Ethan didn't erase anything. He only added a small detail to one of the drawings. A half-open door. The final challenge came at dawn. When the sunlight fully streamed through the mansion for the first time in decades, the silence reacted instinctively, retreating. It was natural. The daytime human presence had always been less pronounced in that place. Ethan remained steadfast. He neither reinforced nor repressed it. He simply endured it, and it worked. The house adjusted to the new routine. The silence found a rhythm compatible with the outside world. No longer absolute, no longer threatening. Ethan grew to understand that his triumph lay not in escaping the horror, but in transforming it into balance. He didn't conquer the mansion, nor was he conquered by it. He became the point of stability between two extremes, and, for the first time since he had arrived, he felt something close to peace. The following days were not marked by abrupt events, but by subtle signs that the balance was still fragile. Ethan perceived this in the small variations of the silence. It no longer manifested as constant pressure, but as waves, sometimes too dense, other times almost non-existent. This instability indicated that something still needed to be resolved. The first concrete preparatory action was to close the subplots that remained open. Ethan revisited the makeshift office in the non-existent hallway. Caleb's notebooks were intact, but now seemed obsolete. He didn't destroy them. Instead, he organized them on a single shelf and carefully closed the door to the room. That phase was over. The obsessive surveillance would not be repeated. The second critical point was the underground room. Ethan descended again down the rough wooden staircase, now stable, feeling the immediate difference in the environment. The cage remained there, but no longer served a containment function. It had become a landmark, a symbolic boundary. He adjusted the symbols on the floor, not reinforcing them, but softening their edges, allowing the silence to circulate without dangerously concentrating. Each action accelerated the pace of the house's internal narrative. The mansion seemed to prepare itself along with him, as if anticipating an inevitable event. The growing tension manifested itself when Ethan realized the outside world was beginning to close in again. A car sped down the hill road. The next day, two young men stopped near the rusty gate, curious. The town, oblivious to what was really happening there, was beginning to remember the existence of the mansion. This brought the final conflict to the forefront. Silence could no longer depend solely on geographical isolation. Something needed to be done before human curiosity shattered the newly established balance. Ethan Adju. He traversed every room of the mansion, closing unfinished cycles. Doors leading to false corridors were sealed permanently. Rooms that accumulated old echoes were rearranged to disperse them. Nothing was destroyed, only relocated. The rhythm of the house accelerated, keeping pace with the approaching climax. On the final night before the inevitable event, the silence intensified once more, not as a threat, but as concentration. Ethan felt that something needed to be confronted directly, not an external entity, but the final residue of everything that had been inadequately contained over the decades. He returned to the center of the mansion, to the main hall, at exactly 2:17 a.m. The clock was no longer there, but the moment remained. The house seemed suspended, as if awaiting confirmation. The walls did not move. The air was still. Absolute silence returned, not by imposition, but by choice. Ethan remained at the center of the space, aware that the climax would not involve escape, physical confrontation, or public revelation. It would be a final adjustment, a definitive test of his ability to maintain his balance without repeating the mistakes of the past. The pace quickened internally. Time seemed compressed. The mansion was ready. Ethan, too. The moment arrived without warning, without a tremor or external sign. At exactly 2:17 a.m., the silence ceased to be mere absence and became absolute presence. There was no air moving, nor the sensation of weight that Ethan had learned to recognize. Everything was suspended, as if the mansion had held its own breath. Then, space responded. The main hall began to transform before his eyes. The walls didn't move abruptly, but slowly rearranged themselves, revealing ancient marks beneath layers of paint and paper. Symbols emerged, not forcibly etched, but as if they had always been there, waiting to be seen. The wooden floor creaked for the first time since Ethan's arrival, announcing that something fundamental was being released. The climax did not begin with an attack, but with an inevitable confrontation. The silence, now fully anchored in Ethan, began to project everything that had been wrongly repressed over the decades. Images materialized in the space around him, not as ethereal visions, but as solid fragments of memory. The Blackwood family appeared, not as helpless victims, but as people making difficult choices. Townspeople emerged in sequence, each accepting the pact out of convenience, fear, or relief. Each generation had added layers to the problem by trying to control what should only have been sustained. The turning point came when Ethan realized that silence no longer needed to be confined within the mansion. The original mistake was not releasing something dangerous, but confining it to a single point, forcing it to accumulate until it became unstable. Silence was not a separate entity. It was the collective reflection of everything that had been hidden, ignored, and pushed away without resolution. The house didn't need an eternal guardian. I needed a break. This understanding marked the protagonist's final transformation. Ethan stopped acting as a rigid support and began to act as a conductor. He walked to the exact center of the hall, where the lines of the floor converged, and opened his arms, not in a dramatic gesture, but a functional, almost technical one. Silence answered immediately. The walls began to release their contents, not in sonic explosions, but in invisible waves that coursed through the structure and spread outward from the mansion down the hill, seeping into the sleeping city. There were no screams, no chaos, just a deep, silent adjustment. The house reacted with restrained violence. Windows shattered, not outwards, but inwards. Doors slammed shut once, closing definitively. The ceiling trembled, throwing dust and fragments of wood to the floor. Ethan stood firm, feeling the weight of the process pass through him without resisting. The plausible turnaround was complete when he realized that by allowing the dispersion, The silence no longer required an exclusive guardian. He was still part of the balance, but he was no longer bound to that place. The transformation was visible. Ethan didn't fight. He wasn't afraid. He wasn't trying to fix things. He adjusted. When the process reached its peak, the mansion emitted its only true sound, a deep crack, like something ancient finally coming loose. Then silence returned. Not absolute, not oppressive, but natural. The climax ended without death, without total destruction, without public revelations. The house remained standing, but it's no longer a prison. Ethan fell to his knees, exhausted, feeling for the first time since he arrived that the weight on his chest was lessening. He hadn't conquered the silence. He had learned to allow it to exist without focusing on it, without it becoming a threat. The mansion grew dark again, but now it looked like just an old building under the moon. The central conflict had been resolved, and irreversibly. The early morning hours passed without further signs of instability. The mansion, now unusually silent, seemed finally integrated into normal time. There was no longer a feeling of constant surveillance, nor the invisible pressure that had previously shaped Ethan's every step. The place remained steeped in history, but not in threat. As the sun began to rise on the horizon, light streamed through the broken windows and illuminated the main hall. For the first time, the space revealed its true age. It no longer seemed like a living organism trying to contain something, but an ancient structure marked by human choices. The cracks, the faded symbols, the displaced furniture, everything now made sense as a consequence, not as a warning. Ethan walked through the house at a calm pace, completing the final arcs. The underground room was stable. The iron cage remained there, but now clearly useless, almost pathetic in its past attempt to contain what could never be imprisoned in that way. He didn't destroy it. Leaving it there was a necessary reminder. Upstairs, the children's rooms still had the drawings on the walls. They no longer seemed like cries for help, but records of an early awareness of what the adults had refused to confront properly. The half-open door that Ethan had drawn remained as it was, a symbol of passage, not escape. Outside, the city was waking up. Cars crossed the nearby road without slowing down. The hill was once again just a high point on the terrain. The silent pact that had sustained the place for decades had ceased to exist, dissolved not by public revelation, but by structural correction. The ultimate consequences quickly became clear. The reports of noises would cease. The diffuse fear that hung over the region would dissipate without explanation. There would be no investigations, news reports, or conspiracy theories. The world would move on, oblivious to the profound adjustment that had occurred overnight. Ethan changed too. He left the mansion at dawn without looking back, not out of contempt, but out of closure. He knew he would never completely detach himself from what he had experienced, but he also understood that he no longer needed to remain trapped in that place to maintain his balance. His arc was completed there. From an investigator in search of hidden truths, he had become someone capable of recognizing when a truth didn't need to be exposed, only resolved. The mansion would remain standing for many years. Perhaps one day it would be demolished, renovated, or forgotten again. That no longer mattered. What lay hidden behind its walls no longer demanded forced silence. The story came to an end not with shouted answers, but with stability, and that was enough. Years later, Blackwood Hill was just another point on the map. The mansion, partially overgrown with vegetation, remained in ordinary silence, visited occasionally by curious people who found nothing but old walls and vague stories. Ethan never published the story he had planned. Instead, he began writing about places where nothing seemed to happen, and curiously, those were his most read articles. No one knew why. Sometimes, upon waking up in the middle of the night, at exactly 2:17 a.m., he would notice the absence of something that had previously weighed heavily on him, and then he would go back to sleep, peacefully. If this story has captivated you this far, it's because the silence also spoke to you. Now we want to know, what do you think was really hidden behind the walls of that mansion? Could it have been just a place, or a reflection of everything we choose to ignore? Leave your interpretation in the comments and share this story with someone who appreciates dark mysteries and unexpected endings. If you enjoy narratives that explore psychological terror, buried secrets, and truths that should never be revealed, subscribe to follow future stories. The next silence may be closer than it seems.